Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first webinar in this series, Getting Started, Who's Doing What and Why You Should Care. My name is Fiona Deller, and I'm the Executive Director, Policy and Partnership at the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I would like to note a few housekeeping items. First, I would like to point out the Q&A on the bottom right side of the screen. Please use this area to send us your questions or to communicate any technical problems that you may be experiencing. We have three really interesting presentations this morning and only an hour, but I think we'll probably have time for a few questions at the end. We would like to answer everyone's questions, but considering the large size of our group today, we would like to apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. When submitting a question or comment through the Q&A panel, please keep the send defaulted to all panelists. That way, all the panelists will be able to see the questions submitted. Also to note, you will be able to find this webinar posted on our website at www.heco.ca after the event is over. So just a few words about the series before we start. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 3 webinars that explore learning outcomes assessment in higher education. In colleges and universities around the world, learning outcomes are quickly becoming the markers of high quality, accountable, and flexible post-secondary education. These clear, concise statements of what students should know and be able to do by the end of a course or a program are quickly becoming the norm. But learning outcomes are only meaningful if they are measurable. In today's webinar, our featured experts are your guides to the still largely uncharted world of learning outcomes assessment. They explore key questions including what are learning outcomes, why are post-secondary institutions assessing them, what do they hope to achieve, and what are some of the challenges associated with learning outcomes assessment. This first webinar introduces you to the basics and paves the way for learning how to create and implement assessment tools at your institution. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to welcome our presenters. With us today, we have Dr. Natasha Jankowski, Associate National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment in the U.S., and Research Assistant Professor with the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Natasha has presented at numerous national conferences and institutional events and written various reports for NALOA. Her main research interests include assessment and evaluation, organizational evidence use, and evidence-based storytelling. Next, we have Mr. Gary Capellas, who is currently the active chair of the Office of Academic Excellence at George Brown College. Gary leads a team dedicated to promoting, supporting, and enhancing the quality of academic programs across the college. His department is responsible for accreditation and compliance, program review, academic policy, supportive program and curriculum development, program approval, and academic pathways. Gary is also the primary investigator on the George Brown Learning Outcomes Consortium project supported by HECO. And finally, we have Dr. Brian Frank, who is an associate professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, the DuPont Canada Chair in Engineering Education Research and Development, and the Director of Program Development in the Faculty of Engineering and Applied Science at Queen's University. He is the coordinator of the EGAD project, providing training and resources for engineering programs for outcome-based assessment. And he is the co-PI on the Queen's University Learning Outcomes Consortium project supported by HECO. We are really, really happy to have all of you with us here today to share your most recent work and insights on learning outcomes assessment. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Natasha.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar. I'm delighted to have such a good audience and wonderful colleagues to speak with us about. So I'm going to sort of kick this off, but definitely leave space for my colleagues to further fill in some of these blanks. So what I want to do is just give a very brief overview of learning outcomes assessment from some of the work that we see happening at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. So just very briefly, if you are not familiar with the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, otherwise known as NALOA. We were really formed in 2008 to have a picture of all the different types of approaches and mechanisms by which institutions were assessing student learning. And we have tried to gather that information through various ways. We do surveys, case studies, document analysis. We've definitely tried to look at this very interesting discussion happening within institutions from various lenses and perspectives. But in addition to sort of conducting research and gathering information on what institutions are doing, we've also then tried to disseminate that information back to institutions. So we have a variety of resources that are available on our website. It's learningoutcomesassessment.org, or you can Google NALOA, and we are not the lacrosse organization that comes up. We are the assessment people. And you can pretty much pull anything that I talk about today, you can find on our website. So there are occasional papers that provide information on these topics and reports. We also recently released a book looking across what we have been seeing happening in the field, and all of that information you can find on our website. So what are we seeing, and sort of what is all this learning outcomes assessment about? Well, a very sort of brief way to frame this is learning outcomes are really verb-driven statements about what students are learning, what they know and can do, but they also signal what we value in education and sort of our end goals and where we want our students to move and our institutions to advance in different areas. And my esteemed colleagues will talk a bit more about what learning outcomes are, but just to point you towards a resource, we do have an occasional paper if you're interested in kind of the concept behind verbs driving learning outcome statements that was written by Cliff Edelman, and his paper is To Imagine a Verb, the Language and Syntax of Learning Outcome Statements. So I would definitely point you towards that. But with understanding that we're talking about measurable statements related to student learning, why? Why do we do this work? Why should we as faculty members care? What's sort of the value and the purpose of engaging in this beyond sort of something that we might have to do for external purposes? And there are various value propositions occurring related to student learning outcomes assessment. So one, in the context of where we're examining institutions' work in this, we are increasingly being asked to show what's the value of attending this institution. Is it worth the cost? When a student graduates, are they going to be employed? Will employers be satisfied with their knowledge and skills and demonstration? Coupled with that, we have our public and policymakers want to know that when their students come here, they're getting a quality education. While quality may be defined very differently for those different groups, and what counts as evidence of that may also be very different, there are concerns and questions about how do we know that when our students come to these institutions, they're receiving a high-quality education. Further, we're asked by our accreditors, regional and program, to show evidence that we have been doing this work, but not just assessing student learning, also using that information to improve. And so while I sort of have top-heavied the value of this work externally, there's a huge impetus as well internally to engage in this work. And that is because looking at if our students are learning what we want them to learn and are able to do what we want them and hope that they can do really provides us information to improve our teaching and learning processes. It also creates enhanced transparency for students. With clarity in our learning outcome statements, we are able to communicate to our students why we're asking them to take the courses that we're asking them to do, why we're asking them to engage in the various educational experiences. And they can help see those connections more broadly across their educational environment, but also then have a language to communicate that to others. So when they leave our institution or when they're talking with employers, being able to talk in a self-reflective manner about what they know and are able to do, which helps us advance them towards lifelong learning. One other sort of point that I want to push on with this is that really, assessment is used to answer various educational questions. And this is important that assessment is question-driven. If we're just sort of doing it to do it, or doing it because it's, something that we need to engage in, it will be less meaningful, and it won't actually provide that value and purpose that we can do to answer questions about quality assurance and answer questions about our curriculum. Is our curriculum doing the things that we hope that it does? In our programs, are our students achieving the outcomes that we want for them? It can also help with cost containment, understanding our students' mobility. As our students become increasingly mobile and attend multiple institutions, assessment takes greater saliency in understanding where they are in their learning, even including aspects of credit for prior learning. But it also sort of all boils down to questions that revolve around what does it really mean to attain a degree? 3? And once you have one, is that a signal of something else, or what does that mean in relation to what you know and can actually do? So with that, let me just tell you a little bit about how we are seeing people actually going about assessing student learning. So I want to pull briefly from a survey report. We regularly survey different levels within institutions, and so the one I'm going to talk about was from 2013. We asked provosts or chief academic officers to respond at an institution-wide level. So what are the things that you're doing to assess all of your students' learning? And if you want to know more about it, you can go and see the abridged or the full report. I always recommend the full. I like having appendices and extra data tables, but if you have a short amount of time, please feel free to take a look at the abridged report. So if you want to see more of the results, because I'm really only going to look at 2, please feel free to go and explore that information. So we asked, what are the various tools that you're using to assess student learning? And on average, institutions are engaging in 5 different approaches to understand their students' learning. So they really have a multifaceted picture of their students, where they are, how that learning is unfolding. But resoundingly, if you're doing one thing, you're giving a national student survey. So these are like the National Survey of Student Engagement, self-reports on the parts of students and related to their outcomes, useful for benchmarking institutions and their peers. But this is quickly followed by rubrics. So using sort of a rubric that is institution-wide. If you're not familiar, I would point you towards AAC&U has a value rubric project, which has 16 rubrics that were created by teams of faculty from across the United States on various outcomes of an education. And so that might be a good resource, but also classroom-based assessment. And that's kind of interesting to think about from an institution-wide level, right? If we're looking at how do we assess students in a classroom in the form of assignments and kind of roll that up to have a picture of our students learning across our institution. Alumni surveys is another, so asking after you've graduated, what you think you know and are able to do. Placement exams, locally developed surveys. I think the only other 2 that might be questionable in terms of understanding, looking at this slide, what they are, is the general knowledge and skills, which is in between locally developed tests and employer surveys. That is your standardized tests. So these are things like the CLA Plus, the CAP, and whatnot. The external, which is under portfolios and right above other, this is external performance assessment. So this is either sending student work out to review panels to look at their work and provide feedback, or having kind of employer panels come in and examine student work and provide them feedback. So the nice thing about that is there is a wide variety, and there's not really one way in which institutions are singularly approaching this work. It's very tailored to the questions they have about the students, what they want to know about their learning, and how that information can be useful to advance practice. One other point that I really want to kind of push on at this time is that, there is not one right way to do assessment, and so it's useful to see how assessment changes over time. So this graph will show you, we gave a very similar survey in 2009, and while some things are the same, and it's nice to see, more assessments happening, you see huge growth on the right side of this graph in terms of rubrics, in terms of employer surveys, portfolios, none of which is overly surprising as we have increasing conversations and employers want to know how our students are learning. Seeing that go up is, it makes a lot of sense. But it's nice to see sort of the salient point that assessment changes, that we do this in different ways in different moments in time, and we get information from various resources. So do not be disconcerted if you are approaching assessment in a different way from your neighbor. That's definitely okay. One sort of 2 final points is we then asked, if you're using all these different approaches, what's the most valuable? And the top 3 responses were classroom-based assessments, so those in-course, on-the-ground assignments that we're asking students to do, the national student surveys, which allow us to provide a benchmark, and rubrics, which help faculty come together and talk across shared language related to student learnings. So what does that mean sort of for challenges that we have to advance this work moving forward? And several briefly. One is that alignment then becomes very crucial. If we are assessing student learning at various levels within our institution, so we're looking at our courses, are our course objectives happening, how does that align? Looking at our program and our specific degree program, are we getting to our outcomes for that? If we have a general education program, is that unfolding? What are we doing across our entire institution? All of those various levels may have different types of assessment happening. There may be lots of misalignment or very good alignment. But if our number one area is that classroom-based assessment, and in the form of assignments, how do we make sure that that alignment is happening across our institution? In addition to that, really thinking about undertaking this work in a meaningful way. So not as something disconnected from teaching and learning, not something that is done to students, but something that is done with them to enhance their understanding of education and that process, but also making this institution-wide. So realizing that this is not just an academic side of the process, that career services, that student affairs, on-campus employment, all have a role to play in this process because our students, if we really think about this from our student perspective, experience the entirety of our institution, not just what happens in a course. And so thinking about how can we make connections across our campus to really strengthen and broaden this work so that anywhere there's a learning opportunity, we can be reinforcing for students along the way what it is that we really want them to do. And that we can do easily by involving multiple campus constituencies and students. But definitely some things to consider as we advance our practice. So with that, I will pause and allow this to go to our next presenter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natasha. I'm going to pass it over to Gary, but I just wanted to mention there have been a number of questions already about specific resources and where specific resources can be found. What we'll do is, with the help of the presenters, we'll put together a list of resources and where they can be found and send it out to, put it on our website and send it out to the people who are participating in the call. But if there are ones that really interest you, feel free to send a question to us anyway, and that way we can be sure to have it on the list. So Gary, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I am the panel representative from the Ontario College System. So in my 10 minutes, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the basic context for learning outcomes in the Ontario Community College System. I'm going to talk a bit about the provincial drivers of learning outcomes and our accountability system, some of the key challenges that I see facing the Ontario College System in regard to learning outcomes. And I'll finish with a practical example from our HECO-funded project, which will make a point. So we're really fortunate in Ontario to work in a community college system that both recognizes and values learning outcomes, and which requires us to use these in the development and delivery of our college curriculum. So for example, in Ontario, there are some college programs that are organized around a mandatory province-wide program standard. This promotes a level of consistency for a particular program, no matter which college delivers it. And where these exist, program standards include a very specific set of, usually about 8 to 12, vocational learning outcomes, and more detailed elements of performance, which are also written in the form of learning outcomes. Vocational learning outcomes focus broadly on the content, knowledge, and skills that are required to prepare a graduate for entry into a specific type of job or profession. Colleges may include additional vocational learning outcomes to reflect their unique context or delivery of that program. Now, for many college programs don't have published program standards, there exists instead something called a program description, which is a much less rigorous, sort of a rough proxy for vocational learning outcomes. Still has program goals. Most college programs are also required to incorporate a set of 11 generically worded program-level learning outcomes known as the essential employability skills. These learning outcomes reflect more general learning and cognitive skills. They're sometimes referred by others as soft skills, such as communication, critical thinking, interpersonal skills, etc. So this is a really high-level overview, but to summarize, Ontario's community colleges are expected to deliver and develop curriculum that incorporates both vocation-specific and more general learning outcomes into the curriculum. That's really the high-level overview, and since you are asking about resources, I want to take my opportunity to give a shout-out to one of the most fantastic resources in Ontario. It's the Curriculum Developers Affinity Group, or CDAG, and I've got the website up there. There's a tremendous amount of information out there to help people understand learning outcomes and how to deal with learning outcomes, particularly in Ontario, and that's a great resource. I should also say that we're really fortunate in Ontario to have an annual Learning Outcomes academic conference, which brings together the colleges and universities to explore our common challenges. Okay, for illustration purposes, I wanted to show you just one example of a program standard for, in this case, the practical nursing programs that are offered by a number of colleges around the province. So what you'll see is that in this particular program standard, there are 9 vocational learning outcomes for practical nursing. And then you'll see also that each of those outcomes is linked to another very detailed set of performance elements, which are also worded in the form of learning outcomes. So that's a lot of our college programs are structured around these kinds of learning outcomes. The next 2 slides, again, just for illustration, give you a bit more information about the 11 essential employability skills. And you'll see that there are 6 skill categories, and for each of these, some further definition of the kind of generic cognitive or learning skills, and finally, a specific learning outcome statement that's meant to be incorporated into the curriculum of college programs. And I've given you the website so you can go and find out more information about these essential employability skills. Colleges actually in Ontario have a lot of autonomy in designing and delivering curriculum, and that includes how they go about assessing or measuring student achievement of the mandatory learning outcomes I've just talked about. However, we're also accountable to our Ministry of Training, Colleges and Development, Training, Colleges and Education to demonstrate the alignment of our curriculum to the common provincial learning outcomes at different stages. So, for example, at the program approval stage, we work with and we gain approval from an outside agency known as the Credential Validation Service to fine-tune our program learning outcomes and to map our proposed courses to the program learning outcomes and the essential employability skills. But once a program has been implemented, colleges are also required on a periodic basis to demonstrate that the curriculum has an ongoing alignment with the current program standards. This is normally accomplished by mapping course-specific learning outcomes to the overarching program vocational learning outcomes and the essential employability skills. The mapping process itself is a really effective way of ensuring that the whole curriculum is reviewed, discussed, and updated by faculty so that it continues to reflect both the provincial standards and industry and community needs. Now, in addition to our accountabilities to the ministry, starting this year, colleges in Ontario will also prepare for an even more rigorous process of learning outcome accountability through our new academic quality accreditation process. Accreditation is administered by the Ontario College Quality Assurance Service, which is an agency of the colleges, not of the ministry. Learning outcomes are a central theme and have an enormous presence and importance in the new accreditation standards. If you look at them, there are 33 quality requirements, and of those 13 refer directly to learning outcomes. So as a key factor in being accredited, Ontario's colleges will need to demonstrate how learning outcomes are actualized, that is, how they're being used in the development of curriculum, how students and faculty are made aware of and understand and use the relevant learning outcomes, how learning outcomes are used to create meaningful assessment activities, and how we go about measuring and demonstrating the achievement of integrated learning across a program by the end of the program and prior to graduation. Here's some of the assumptions and challenges that I've been thinking about in terms of assessing learning outcomes in the Ontario Community College system. We work in a system that is clearly driven by learning outcomes, what I've been saying for the last few minutes. Colleges really continue to work hard at building internal capacity to be able to deliver and support outcome-based learning. So particularly for people like me who came into teaching later in their careers, outcome-based learning is a pretty radical, different approach to thinking about and organizing teaching and learning. So this presents faculty development challenges for colleges to build faculty capacity, to ensure that learning outcomes are actually the centerpiece of curriculum design and assessment, both at the course level and at the program level. Second, we practice outcomes-based learning within a traditional and pretty rigid credit granting system that is hours and course completion-based, not necessarily outcomes-driven. And that provides additional challenges to us to be creative in terms of outcome assessment. The third, and I've described in the last few minutes, is the complexity of addressing the multiple mandatory learning outcomes in the college system. We'll consider that many of our provincial program standards and almost all of our program descriptions are outdated, don't necessarily reflect current curriculum requirements. Best practices in the crafting of learning outcome statements are not necessarily reflected in the existing provincial learning outcomes for which we're accountable, and as a result, meaningful assessment strategies don't readily flow necessarily from these learning outcome statements. And since colleges have so much autonomy in determining how they will assess student performance in achieving the common learning outcomes, there's also a question of consistency. So, for example, a student from one college engineering technology program being assessed against the required learning outcomes as rigorously as a student from another college. Practically, doing this stuff well is intellectually challenging and it's resource intensive. So do we have the expertise, the time, and the resources to develop meaningful assessments that are authentic and valid and sustainable? Can we triangulate the results of multiple approaches to assessment of a learning outcome? Can we integrate assessments over time and across multiple courses to provide a better indication at key points, such as the end of the year or at graduation, that students have integrated and can apply their cumulative knowledge and skills? One last challenge. In my opinion, and I think it's shared by some of my colleagues in the audience, that the essential employability skills, or at least some of them, are not given as much weight or importance as the vocational learning outcomes in the development and delivery of curriculum. It's well established in colleges that the essential employability skills, because of their generic nature, are somewhat of a challenge to incorporate into the curriculum. So what exactly are teachers supposed to be teaching in their courses? How are teachers supposed to assess them? How do we scaffold or integrate essential employability learning and assessment across a whole program? This is an issue that we wanted to explore in our own HECO-funded project. So let me finish by talking about that. We set out to develop a validated tool or a rubric for assessing one of the mandatory essential employability skills, that being critical thinking. In the process of our project, what we discovered was the faculty in our project were not necessarily or explicitly teaching critical thinking skills, even if it was alluded to in a course outline, but they were still expecting students to demonstrate critical thinking in graded assignments. Well, this observation caused us to think more about the need to work with faculty to ensure that critical thinking learning outcome was being made more explicit, and that critical thinking was actually being discussed and taught and practiced before being assessed. So in other words, there's no point in developing a really great assessment tool if the content really isn't happening in the classroom to assess. So I think this is a common challenge for all of the essential employability skills, and we elected to focus on critical thinking as a way of developing a process for making that real in the classroom and providing a way of assessing it. So for me as a teacher and administrator, this stuff is complex and really stimulating. It's why I'm so thrilled that there is a great and building interest out there about outcomes-based learning, how to assess outcomes, and that we've got an active community of practice here in Ontario, and that HECO has chosen to shine a light on this really important area of teaching and learning. So that concludes my bit, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Brian.
Thanks very much, Gary. Brian, over to you.
Well, thank you, and hello, everybody, and welcome to the last third of this session. It's been interesting seeing the interesting comments come through, so we look forward to being able to answer some of the questions. I'm going to speak from the perspective of doing this work specifically in engineering at Queen's University. Also with the EGAD project, this is the national group providing training and resources for engineering programs and adapting the outcomes-based assessment, and also some of the work we've been doing with the HECO project at Queen's. So really this is focusing on why and so what. When we talk about this, we often focus on learning outcomes being useful both for learning, as Natasha and Gary have both focused on. It's also quite important at the institutional level in doing curriculum development, space planning, student services, academic support planning. All these things are impacted by answering the question of what do we want students to be able to do and resourcing that appropriately. And it does respond to pressure for accountability, as we've heard from the previous presenters. It also supports credit transfer. We're doing some work in that area. And it does allow us to determine what kinds of mode delivery we're looking for at our institutions. The value of doing this in running workshops, we find is that people often aren't aware that there actually is significant demonstrated evidence for using learning outcomes. The most significant of which I'm aware is one by John Hattie. His book on visible learning has been well regarded. His study involved 800 meta-analyses, over 200 plus million students. And one of the conclusions of the study was that having explicit objectives and assessment in a program is actually one of the most significant things we can do to improve learning in higher education. You can see in the chart the red one corresponds to explicit objectives and assessment. The other things that could be done, but as you can see, determining what we want students to do and making sure we're assessing it so it's clear to students is one of the most significant things we can do to improve learning. The learning outcomes is one element of what we might call a good continuous improvement process, whereby we start with a learning environment at the top, but identify what specifically we want students to be able to do as part of a program or in a course, to make some kind of a mapping between what we want students to do and what the curriculum looks like, to do some assessment across the program, to then do some analysis and evaluation, and use that as a continuous cycle of determining what we want, measuring it, evaluating the data, and using it to improve the quality of the program. And of course, outcomes are critical for all that. Outcomes are helpful in doing curricular development. So what you see right now is an example of one institution where you've got 4 key expectations there shown in the left column. And along the other columns, year 1, 2, 3, and 4, the ability to plan exactly what we're hoping students will be able to do in years 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the program. This allows us to explicitly provide connection between courses and a series of courses. It allows us to identify what we're hoping to do for assessment. It allows us to make sure we don't have significant gaps between one course and another. So it does really support having appropriate supports in place and appropriate assessment in place to meet our goals at the end. It allows us to have significant conversations about what's happening within courses. So what you see now is an example of data within one course. And 3 outcomes are shown there along the histogram. There's an outcome for problem analysis, one for design, and one for communication. Along the bottom, you see the rubric that was used for assessing that, and allows, with this kind of data, relatively simply, to have a conversation about what's going on within a course environment, where are students doing well, where are they not doing so well, based on how students are doing compared to what should be relatively clear expectations shown in the rubric. And this allows conversations within a course, and by using multiple courses, allows conversations at a department level about how students are faring relative to expectations. It allows us, once we identify these, to also look at student development across multiple years. So Natasha mentioned the AAC and U value rubrics. We use this as part of our HECO-funded Learning Outcomes Assessment Consortium study. So what you see right now are data points. We've actually taken student work from within courses and then scored them on problem solving. That's the graph you see on the left, and critical thinking, as you see on the right, and taken these artifacts from the beginning of year 1 and the end of year 1 or the beginning of year 2, and also looked at students in the 4th year of their program, and allows us to say if we feel that problem solving is a key expectation, and within problem solving you can see the different dashed lines in the left plot of defining a problem, identifying strategies. Those would be specific learning outcomes we have within the program. How are students faring in those key things from year 1 into year 2 into year 4? In this case, you can see that using the same rubrics, using the AAC, and U value rubrics, we're actually able to measure significant gains between years 1 to year 2 to year 4. So this is certainly encouraging for a program, and it also allows us to ask questions about, do we see things that look a little odd? So in the second plot on the right, you see towards the end of year 1, some of the scores are actually going down. So it leaves us some questions about, is the data reliable, or are we actually seeing some differences in expectations of the assignments? But it does allow us to have a conversation. It does give us something to identify how well students are developing. It allows us also to benchmark, and this is something that we want to be quite cautious about because, of course, the goal of this is not to go to an approach of having standardized testing and doing it as a way of trying to brag about our institutions, but it does allow us to look at how an institution compares to others as one piece of data in addition to many, many others. So this is one piece of data from our study where we've looked at first-year students at our institutions, shown the yellow dot, and red-year students, fourth-year students is the red dot, in comparison with other institutions across North America. And so, again, allows us to see that using a particular tool which has been standardized, this is the CLA+, we can see how our students fare and how our students change from incoming first year to 4th year. What's the value add, essentially, from being at the institution for 4 years? It also allows us to visualize our curriculum. So once we have outcomes identified, we can visualize it. This plot may be a little hard to understand at first, but I'll step through it. Each of the large rectangles is one of our key expectations. We call them attributes in engineering. And so the red square now circles the one called problem analysis. Students need to be able to solve complex problems. Within that, we have 8 specific learning outcomes. So the area of that rectangle is proportional to the number of outcomes we have in the area. And the color of each of those little rectangles within the big one shows us the number of assessment points we have. So anything that's dark green has been assessed multiple times. Anything that's yellowish really hasn't been assessed. And so by doing that across all of our curriculum, we can pretty quickly see what's being assessed, what's not being assessed, and how many outcomes we have for any given area of focus. If we were to take a look at one at the bottom corner, under ethics and equity, where the red rectangle is right now, you see that one's only got 4 particular outcomes, and 2 of them are yellow, which means they're not being assessed. So it very quickly allows us to determine where's the emphasis on our program. We can see right now that ethics and equity in this program are not a significant focus, and it leads to a conversation within a department, within a faculty, about is that appropriate? Are we having an appropriate balance of expectations within the program? We can also, once we've done a lot of assessment, try drawing some conclusions about how students are faring across the entire program. I mentioned some examples of how this can be done within one course, Here's an example of, this is about 60,000 data points across an entire program. On the right side, the red rectangle circles years 1, 2, 3, and 4. So each year is plotted in a band. First year is on top, then second year, third year, and fourth year. Along the bottom, we have our key 12 attributes required for engineering. So the first one, the CO on the left, is communications. Next one's design, etc. So each one is kind of a key theme within our outcome expectations. And so, for example, in the first year of our program, we could look at how students are faring in communication. And we have, in this case, expectations on a 5-element rubric from not demonstrated at the bottom up to mastery at the top. And we can see we have 2 data points showing us students are generally, on average, at the high quality level. We could also look at what's happening in the second year of the program, where the red rectangle is now, and we can see we've got at least 1 data point where the student expectation, or the average of the student performance was just at meets expectations, so it's quite a bit lower. So again, this kind of a plot allows us to, within a program, have conversation about the strength of the program, about the strength of the students, about where we may have weaknesses, and allows a good conversation at the department or faculty level about how we can improve. We can also ask the question of triangulation. Can we trust our data? So this shows a plot of 3 different assessment approaches. Details aren't terribly important, but the numbers joining them up show the correlation between the various approaches. So it can allow us to ask, do we trust the data? Do we trust the fact that we actually have assessed the same thing in 2 different ways, and use that as a way of encouraging people to take this data seriously? In the end, this allows us to develop a culture of thinking about learning goals, a culture of measuring and making improvement, and that's, in my mind, really what this is the real value, is getting people to have a conversation, encourage a culture of it, and have discussions about teaching within the institution and within our departments. We've, as part of our study, talked quite a bit about trade-offs in assessment, about authenticity being traded-off with cost. The more authentic the assessment is, generally the more complex it is, the more time it takes to score it or evaluate it somehow. We also trade off reliability with cost in many cases because of having to do things repeatedly or parallel tests or things like that. And also in using either standardized benchmarkable tools which allow us to compare with other institutions. But on the other hand, they often are less authentic, and they lead to students really lacking motivation to do it because they do not see it connected to their study. So there are quite a few trade-offs we've been looking at as part of our study. We've at times had questions about why don't we just use grades to assess outcomes? We have course grades. Why isn't that sufficient? One of the points is that course grades are usually aggregates. They're aggregates of multiple expectations. So as in the red circle here, electrical design capstone, if the student's grade is 86, that often encompasses a huge number of what we might call learning outcomes, focusing on communication, focusing on problem solving, on teamwork. And so simply relying on course grades doesn't provide us the information. It also doesn't answer many of the questions you see shown there in the green bubbles about how well the students are prepared to solve open-ended problems, learn independently, consider societal implications, etc. Those aren't identified if we simply try to use grades as a way of assessment. What we're talking about here in this context is really what's called criterion referenced evaluation. So we have a specific criteria we're looking for students to be able to do, and that's in contrast to the more traditional norm reference where we have some kind of a bell curve and we tell the student, you have a 67. That's useful for comparing students to each other, not so useful to initiate conversations among faculty and with students and with administration about how our programs are faring and developing the kinds of expectations we have. And so with that, I will stop and turn things back over to Fiona.
Thanks very much, Brian. There are a number of questions coming in, so I want to turn to them right away. But first, I just want to mention, because a couple of people have asked this, both the slides and the webinar, the audio webinar, will be available to you. So we are going to post them on our website, so www.heqco.ca, and look for the Learning Outcomes tab. Click on that, and it will take you to the place that you need to be. If you can't find it, just send us an email and let us know. So I'm going to take the questions in the order that they came in. So let's start with a question about, for all panelists, a question about transferability. So the question is, transferability is an important consideration. What are the panelists' thoughts on the relationship of learning outcomes and national standards? And what I thought is I'd start with Gary, go to Brian, and then Natasha. It would be interesting to have an American perspective on that as well.
So maybe it's a good thing that I used that particular example about the program standard for practical nursing. What I didn't say about that, the development of that standard and those learning outcomes was the requirement to be aligned with the entry to practice criteria from the Ontario College of Nurses. So there's a real direct correlation between what we're teaching and what a graduate practical nurse is expected to be able to do at the time that they apply for their license. So to the extent to which those things are aligned, I think sort of speaks to transferability. It should guide what we are teaching them and what they should be able to demonstrate by the time they graduate so that they can be successful in the next stage, where there are, very clearly industry-determined standards of practice.
So following up on that, within engineering, this is certainly supporting conversations about what our programs are expecting. ONCAT, which is an organization in Ontario, somewhat similar to HECO but focusing on transferability and articulation, has been having some discussions about how learning outcomes can be used to support transferability between institutions, university, and college university, and vice versa. And there's been some significant thought given to how outcomes might support this. One of the factors that is of interest to me, and actually we're doing some work on this the next year, is how we can take learning outcomes but also try to identify the unstated implicit context embedded in those outcomes, which in programs we often don't talk about because we just know what kind of things we do and what we expect students to do without saying all the details. But in many cases, for supporting transferability between institutions or college, university, or vice versa, it's really important to understand what the context is of the assessment if we're to use that as a way of supporting transferability.
Thanks, Brian. Natasha?
Yeah, I don't know how useful my response will be for this, but I'll throw it out there and see what sticks. But I think transferability is a very interesting conversation, especially when you think about learning outcomes, but national standards, but just sort of agreement on, do we have a shared understanding of when I say critical thinking, you know what I mean by critical thinking, and that there's something across institutions that we can share and advance in that regard. And it's interesting, you look at articulation agreements, and they're rarely done around the outcomes. It's very content-focused. It's a history of individual relationships between institutions in my context. And so thinking about if we are getting to a place where we have very clearly stipulated what our outcomes are, where that's happening, how our students are getting it, and actual demonstrations of students' work around this, I think that has a lot of implications for how we can think about transfer in a very a different way. It not only knowledge transfer for students to integrate and apply it in different settings and contexts, but also thinking about how have we structured our transfer systems in a way that doesn't allow space for outcomes. And so I think it's heartening for me to see work on co-curricular inventories or alternative transcription processes, mostly in relation to competency-based education models, but also just more so sort of between institutions saying, if we move to a way of talking about outcomes as sort of the currency, how could we talk about that more broadly? But that whole conversation has happened sort of outside of a national standards and more of a kind of shared language approach. So I'm not sure if that is useful, but I think there's a lot of interesting work happening around that question.
Thanks, Natasha, and what a great setup actually for our next webinar, which is all about common language. I'm going to go to the second question. Again, this is for all panelists, so why don't we do the same sort of Gary, Brian, and then Natasha. The question is, what kind of support would you recommend to ensure constructive alignment of outcomes and meaningful assessment? So Gary, why don't you start?
I am hoping that what the question is asking about is what can the college do to support faculty to do this, and in our system we have expert faculty who really understand about outcomes-based learning and provide sort of the structural support about getting from what is it I want them to learn to wording these things into really meaningful learning outcome statements, either within a course or across a program. The challenge then is to think about how to develop assessments that can actually be used and which kind of meet the criteria that that Brian was talking about before, that they're doable, they're sustainable, they're valid and reliable, all of that stuff. So I think it's the extent to which we as an organization can support our faculty in developing these things. But so I was saying before, I think it all boils down to our ability as an organization to support outcomes-based learning as an approach to developing the curriculum, not just at the measurement end. I'm not sure if that answered the question or not.
Thank you very much. Brian?
One of the things that we start with when focusing on, I think what the question's getting at is, first off, why this is important. So some of the things that I think Natasha and Gary and I have talked about, and then focused on what this is useful, why this is useful. So we do a lot of faculty development trying to show some examples. So what we often do is show some of the kinds of data or conclusions that either this program or that program has come to as a result of this process, and focus on this among faculty as not being something that is new or prescribed from above, but simply as a way of taking unstated, implicit expectations that pretty much any instructor has, making it explicit, so writing it down and putting it somewhere, and then trying to connect everything between each other. It's really not anything that's necessarily being driven from outside or is even necessarily prescriptive. In accreditation environments, that's a little bit different, but in most cases we focus on figure out what it is that you think is important, and also focus on it being an iterative process, that the goal or the process for determining what you're looking for in your program and assessing it, and then drawing some meaningful conclusions. That's very much an iterative process where the goal should not be to create a full-on, massively complex process from the beginning, but rather to think about a few things you want to do, measure them fairly well, look at your data, and then see how to improve both the process and also the quality of the educational environment.
Thank you. Natasha?
Yeah, I think in terms of just very sort of tangible types of support for faculty to do this in a meaningful way that actually really does have a good alignment and reflection of happening is that there has to be space and time for faculty to dialogue with each other and to reflect on their practices. Why are we doing the things that we're doing for these students at this time? And how do we think that doing this impacts their learning? And really kind of unpacking assumptions we have about students, assumptions we have about our curriculum, thinking about our courses in terms of something that's planned, but then how is it also enacted, which might be very differently from how we planned it. So I think support for this work to be very meaningful definitely requires space and time to reflect and have that dialogue. But it also very much requires reward and recognition for faculty to be involved in this work, that it is worthwhile work, that it is part of the teaching and learning process, and that there is something tangible that can come back to faculty for participating in this. But I think also sort of the last point to think about for supporting this work is thinking about within our institutions, how have we organized the processes of doing assessment in terms of who owns this work? Is it part of our faculty governance structure? Have we created an organization focused on the examples that Brian was sharing they're very embedded in the teaching and learning process, or have we created a more reporting system that might then not be as meaningful? So I think if we're thinking about support, it's where is the space to do this work, how are faculty recognized for it, and how have we organized our processes around this to make it about learning, and then we have a much better chance of it to be meaningful.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to get in hopefully two more questions. Brian, why don't we start with you this time, go to Natasha, and then Gary. So the question is, do all elements of performance have to be met through assessment?
I think, I'll try to interpret what I think the question is getting at. We tend to focus on assessment as driving the ability to answer a question about a student overall, as opposed to within specific courses, or even to get down to necessarily nitty-gritty check boxes of list of performance. This does vary between faculty. So, for example, in the School of Medicine, the accreditor requires a very different process than what we expected for business or engineering, which is also quite different from what would be expected for unaccredited activities. The elements of performance that we use are created by faculty, are generally at the course level, though we also do some at the program level. And we would not be expecting, for the purpose of graduation, for example, that every single student is meeting some particular level of performance by the time they graduate. We look at this much more as a way of gathering information about both individual students, cohorts, and the program overall, and using it as a program improvement process. I'm not exactly sure if I answered the question, but that's my attempt at it. I'll turn it over to Gary to see if he has more thoughts.
So I was thinking that the little map that you showed, Brian, I think says a lot. It's about thinking about what's being assessed and where in a program across a lot of courses, about how we use formative as well as summative assessment. Not everything has to be assessed the same way. Yeah, I mean, there's a limit to what is reasonable and possible to assess. But it's thinking about how all of these things sort of add up to kind of an overall integrated learning at the end of a program, which I guess can be assessed.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to really add to those comments. This is sort of the difficulty of webinars, because you can't sort of look at the person and get a good read on if you're responding to the question in the right kind of way. I think the only other piece that I would add is you can think about assessment as holistically or as in compartmentalized pieces. And I think if you have kind of a capstone experience in a program where you are asking students to integrate and apply sort of the cumulative knowledge base and skills across that, then yes, I think you could. But I think I'll just leave my response with it depends, and I agree with Brian and Gary.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We had a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to, and it's really nice to see so many questions, but too bad that we couldn't get to them all. But you have the contact information for each of Natasha, Brian, and Gary, and please feel free to send your questions directly to them. And I would like to thank them very much at this point for joining us. It's been a really, really interesting hour. I would also like to take a moment to encourage everyone to register for our next 2 webinars on learning outcomes assessment, which take place on April 30th and May 28th at 11 o'clock EST. We will send you a link shortly, or you can register on our website at www.haco.ca. Also on our website, you can find links to all our work on learning outcomes assessment, including our recently published Learning Outcomes Assessment Handbook, and a call for the second round of proposals to expand our Learning Outcomes Assessment Consortium. Finally, when you leave the webinar, we ask that you just take a second and complete the survey. We'd really like to hear from you about your experience with the webinar so we can improve what we're doing, and also we would very much welcome ideas for future webinars. So thank you again to our presenters, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.